YouTube, what's good? It's your man Ribs from Doing Film Things. Every single week I drop a new video about film photography, so if that's your thing, definitely go ahead and subscribe. Today we are going to be doing a film review on Kodak Ektar 100. This film's getting a lot of hype recently, and I've read a lot of really good things about it in terms of landscapes and just beautiful nature stuff. So when I went to the Lake District, I decided to bring a whole bunch of this film and give it the full test. Quick plug, I do have a playlist right here that covers a lot of different reviews on different film stocks that I've used over the time. So if you want to see more of that, go ahead and check out that playlist. Basically, you look up Ektar and you're going to see lots of beautiful photos of beautiful mountains, seascapes, forest things, you know, you name it, anything that's out in nature. And so I figured I'm going to the Lake District and there's going to be tons of beautiful landscape stuff there. Let's go take some of this Ektar and let's see what we can do. I shot this film both in 35mm and 120 format across a couple different cameras. So I think I got a pretty good experience about how this film performs, regardless of format and regardless of the type of camera. Before I give you any of my thoughts, let's take a look at some of my photos. So you saw my photos from the trip there. What are my first impressions? Well, I find that this film is very crisp and clean. Gives you really strong color, really bold saturation. But there's one bad thing that I also found, and that's that this film tends to have a bit of a purpley magenta cast on my images. Basically, every single image that I look at had some version of magenta or purple kind of leaking into the shadows. I'm not exactly sure where this came from, whether it was from developing, whether it's the film itself has this actual characteristic, or if this has something to do with my color conversion using Negative Lab Pro or any software for that matter. I don't want to directly accuse the film given that it may or may not be actually providing this look, but there's a lot of steps in the process that could give you different types of looks, and therefore you definitely have to keep that in mind when processing your film. Nonetheless, I saw this across a lot of different images, and I find that it was most evident in images that were a bit darker or perhaps featured an overcast scene or were perhaps a bit underexposed. It seems like Ektar does something funky with the shadows when there's not enough light hitting that part of the image. This isn't necessarily a deal breaker because it is fairly simple to fix, and I found myself for a lot of my images going into Negative Lab Pro after the conversion and then actually tweaking the sliders to introduce a bit more green and a bit more yellow and also a little bit more cyan in order to overcome that magenta cast. It tends to do the trick, but you can see some pretty big examples here. I'm going to show you some before and after so that you can see exactly what I was getting right out of Negative Lab Pro at the beginning and then how I edited the image in order to see something different. This magenta cast was much less evident in images that were very bright or featured a lot of direct sunlight or images that I overexposed intentionally or unintentionally. So I really do think it has something to do with the exposure. A lot of films do different things when you overexpose or underexpose, and it seems like this particular film stock, when you underexpose, definitely introduces some of that magenta into your shadows. So what do you think? Am I correct here? Do you find that this is a characteristic of Ektar, or do you think I did something during my processing that introduced this magenta cast? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to understand where everybody's coming from. Okay, so let's move on to some non-color related things. This film definitely shines when it comes to sharpness and grain. As advertised, this film is supposed to be super fine grain, and it definitely is. You can zoom into your images here and you do find a hard time finding some very evident grain. Of course, this is film, so there's always gonna be a tiny hint here and there, but this film, more than any other film, really lacks very obvious grain. And it's pretty cool to see because you get some really good quality images that are very sharp, especially if your camera has really sharp lenses. Additionally, this film performs just as good as any other quality professional film when it comes to dynamic range. You're definitely able to push and pull your highlights and your shadows as much as you need to, And that's especially important for landscapes, given that oftentimes you're gonna have a sky that is much brighter than your foreground, and therefore having that flexibility really makes a difference. So let's talk about price, and I know that everybody cares about price. This film is actually a professional level film, and therefore it's gonna cost a bit more than some of your budget options. I would price this film basically the same as Portra 160, although Portra 160 sometimes is cheaper than this, and potentially, depending on the format, it might be a little bit more expensive. But nonetheless, it's basically in the same category there. Here in the UK, we get it for about £9 per roll, depending on whether it's 35mm or 120 format. And in the States, it's probably the same price except in dollars. So I got in the darkroom and made a print of one of my favorite 35mm Ektar images that I shot at the Lake District. This is what we have right here. This image definitely showcases that strong, bold color that I was mentioning with regards to the green, and generally shows you what Ektar is about. I wasn't using the sharpest lens when I took this photo, but it definitely is pretty sharp nonetheless. And I think even with a better, more higher end lens, you would have gotten an even better result. But great dynamic range here. I definitely did burn the sky just a little bit in order to make it a bit darker than the rest of the image. And it got me something that I was really happy about. So I definitely vouch for Ektar when it comes to printing. It does exactly what you would expect it to. Ultimately, I find myself asking this question: what is the purpose of this film? I know I mentioned a lot about landscape, and I mentioned something about fine grain and that kind of thing. And that's definitely apparent here. This is definitely a good film for those purposes. But is it that much better that you want to use this instead of Portra 160? I'm just not sure. I feel more familiar with Portra 160 as something that I feel gives me a bit more of a blank canvas that I can mess around with. And therefore, I feel more comfortable probably using that instead of Ektar 100. 160, I can just shoot it at 100, slightly overexposed, and I still think I get a really good result as per what I'm looking for. So I just don't really know what the point of this film is. I know it's targeted at some specific uses, but is it really that much better at those uses? It's a hard question to answer. Next time I go shoot landscapes, I think I am gonna stick to Portra 160. For whatever reason, Ektar doesn't really call to me or give me a real reason for me to buy this film in bulk or anything like that. So I think I'm just gonna stick to the Portra going forward. I'm really curious what people have to say about this film, given that I'm not totally convinced that it's the right film for me. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, definitely drop me a like as well, as that makes a big difference for me. If you wanna see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe. And that's all I got for you today, y'all. Peace.